Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Elephants. I'm your host, Destiny Farley, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Stephen Bates on the timely issue of freedom of speech and the First Amendment. Dr. Bates graduated from Harvard Law School in 1987 and currently teaches First Amendment law and other classes here at UNLV. He is the author, co-author, or editor of 5 books. His work has appeared in many notable journals and news outlets, including Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, First Amendment Law Review, as well as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Slate, and the Wilson Quarterly. I first met Dr. Bates during my first semester of grad school, and I was immediately drawn to his classes and just his overall approach to teaching. He's someone who I consider to be very open-minded and diplomatic and encourages challenging discourse in a tasteful way, and I just really admire him and think he's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. I asked him to join me today to discuss some of the major current events that have been going on in the media lately surrounding freedom of speech, including obviously the incidents with Charlie Kirk, Jimmy Kimmel, etc., and just the overall state of free speech in America today. But before jumping into the specifics of all of that, Dr. Bates, can you just briefly introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about your background in First Amendment law and what drew you to that type of law specifically?
Sure. Thank you for having me, first of all. I grew up in West Texas in a very small town called Pecos that was 100 miles from a bookstore or a movie theater or anything, and was interested in becoming a journalist. I worked for the local newspaper, and in high school I wanted to start a literary magazine, and the principal told me I couldn't pass it out on campus. So I wrote to an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Student Press Law Center and got a letter from the director of it saying, you absolutely have a right to pass out something on campus as long as you're not disrupting things. So I took his letter to the school board and met with them and passed it around, gave everyone a copy, and they read it. And one of the school board members said, you know, this says what the Supreme Court says, but the Supreme Court knows what's right for New York and for Washington, D.C., but they don't understand Texas. So we're not going to let you do that. And I then, the Student Press Law Center was ready to prepare briefs and everything for a lawsuit, but I couldn't get a local lawyer who was ready to file the case. That sort of whetted my appetite and triggered my interest in First Amendment law. So when I got to Harvard Law School, that's really what I focused on. At least back then, Harvard was the largest law school in the country, which meant that there were a lot of different electives on different aspects of the First Amendment. So I could take a lot of courses on freedom of religion, freedom of the press, et cetera. And that's what I did. I really focused on that.
So it was like an experience when you were young, kind of in your formative years, that lit a fire underneath you and made you feel like you wanted to go in and not necessarily change the system, but enforce fairness in the system. Is that like an accurate description?
Yes, not even necessarily enforce, but understand the system and the issues in it and the complications with enforcing the law in it. This was 15 or so years after the Supreme Court had ruled that school prayer was unconstitutional, but my school still had school prayer. And it was a lesson that until somebody sues, the Constitution is not self-enforcing. And that was something that wasn't obvious to me as a high school student, and it turns out to be pretty important.
So is the town that you grew up in Texas pretty conservative? Was it pretty right-leaning?
Well, it was very conservative Democratic then, and now it's very conservative Republican, but It was always conservative.
And why didn't they want to let you pass out your magazine? Was there something in there that was controversial, or?
No, they'd never seen it. And it was a literary magazine. It was full of bad poetry, so it was nothing that was going to cause any disruption. I think, like all school officials, they wanted control, and they didn't want anything outside their control, and this would have been that. Maybe sort of paranoia on their part. It wouldn't have disrupted anything at all, but why risk it from their perspective?
What was your experience like at Harvard? Is it as hard as they say it is?
Well, I went there undergrad and had a wonderful experience. I was thrilled to get away from Texas and get to a place where not only was it not 100 miles to a bookstore, there was a bookstore across the street from my dorm, and it was open till 11 p.m. every day. So I loved that. Harvard Law School was difficult and in many ways is less like college than like first grade, in that you have an assigned seat and you may get called on without warning. So that took some adjusting. But after first year, when I was taking classes I chose rather than classes that were chosen for me, I enjoyed it a lot. I was a research assistant through work study for a constitutional law professor named Lawrence Tribe, which I enjoyed a lot, and updated the religion law chapter of his treatise. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Was it like a culture shock for you at all, coming from a small town in Texas to, it's in Boston? Is that where Harvard is?
Yeah. It's suburban Boston. But I was probably too stupid to fully realize the extent to which I didn't fit in.
I don't think you could be at Harvard and be stupid. I think those are kind of mutually exclusive.
You'd be surprised. But the ways in which, I didn't fully fit in or wasn't fully acculturated. I loved it. It was a great chance to get to know smart students and incredibly smart professors who had made an impact on the world. And then there were just amazing people sort of coming through town who would speak at Harvard and were open to meeting with students. And those were opportunities I wouldn't have gotten elsewhere, I think.
So major universities are, if you will, notoriously known for being a little bit more liberal in nature politically, especially Ivy League schools. I don't know if that was the case in 1987 or during your time there, or if it's still that way now, or if studying that type of law made that sort of irrelevant, because of the fact that you're studying First Amendment law. All types of speech and discourse are encouraged in the classroom. What was your experience as far as that goes? Did you feel comfortable, like, asking controversial questions? Was critical thinking encouraged in the classroom, even if it wasn't necessarily, in alignment with whatever the dominant political view was at the university?
I think then it was. My understanding is that there's a lot more reluctance to speak out now, that there's much more of a chilling effect from students and maybe from faculty too on certain dissenting voices. But back then it was pretty free and easy across the political spectrum. At least that was my impression.
Okay. We'll kind of circle back on that, more towards the end of the episode. But just to sort of set a foundation, for the duration of the conversation, can you sort of, high-level detail what the First Amendment is and what it protects?
Sure. The nation adopted the Constitution, and kind of reluctantly, James Madison and others agreed to add a Bill of Rights to it. And a Bill of Rights would say that the government could not trespass on certain rights, meaning that the government might have powers to abridge freedom of speech, for example, but they wouldn't do it. And so they added the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech, press, religion, petition, assembly, to the Constitution. And that's basically where the First Amendment came from. And it didn't have much impact on constitutional law for the first century plus, but it's had quite a big impact for the second century plus.
Do you think it's significant that it was the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights?
It is absolutely not significant at all. There were two amendments that the states rejected. So it was sent out as the Third Amendment and became the first because the states rejected two others.
Oh, interesting. I would have thought, and I should probably know this because I took your First Amendment class, but so shame on me. But I would have thought that it being, because I think I see people make that argument a lot where it's like there's a reason that it's the First Amendment in the Constitution, people pulling it out of context.
People may, and maybe there's an argument that symbolically we should treat it that way, but in terms of the framers' intent, there's no argument. No.
Okay, historically speaking. Do you think that the average American, understands the First Amendment, misunderstands it? Are there misconceptions about what it does and doesn't protect, especially in like the modern age with social media and stuff like that? Like, what are the biggest misconceptions that you see?
I guess two big ones, I don't know if they're the biggest, but two huge ones are, first, a lot of people see hate speech as an exception, and it's not. On the whole, the First Amendment protects hate speech the same as it protects everything else. There are certain things it doesn't protect, including threats, and often hate speech includes threats, so that would be excluded. But hate speech is not a categorical exception to the First Amendment. And second, I think a lot of people think the First Amendment protects you against corporations as well as against government. And it doesn't. The First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law, which has been interpreted to cover all of government, but that's all. It doesn't say anything to Facebook or X or Instagram or anybody else. They are legally free to kick you off for any reason or for no reason if they feel like it, whereas the government would have to give you due process and go through certain procedures to, for example, kick you out of a public park where you were protesting in a way they didn't like.
Do you think that there's merit to the idea of protecting hate speech, or why is that something that might be protected?
Well, one reason is it's pretty easy to interpret or to argue that hate speech includes any speech you don't like, which I think President Trump has done lately, that basically any speech that's against him is hate speech. And Attorney General Bondi was doing that, saying that speech against Charlie Kirk was hate speech. So there's a danger that creating a hate speech exception will get bigger and bigger and bigger and be used in a politically partisan way. So that's one response to that.
So it's, for lack of a better term, almost like a necessary evil in protecting the First Amendment as a whole.
Well, that's the case with a lot of things that we find offensive. The argument is that if we make one exception, we'll soon be making lots of exceptions. And that may not be totally persuasive because we are making a lot of exceptions now. We're saying that you can get in trouble for violating copyright, say. But still, that's the argument, that if we carve out an exception for hate speech, soon it will be applied in sort of mischievous ways.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned this misconception that the First Amendment applies to corporations, right, which is another issue that we run into frequently. Obviously, at the time of the conception of the Constitution, corporations weren't yet a thing. And maybe, you can only answer this question hypothetically, but given the intent of the framers and, what they were trying to accomplish with the Bill of Rights, do you think that had they written it today, that it would also apply to corporations because of the sheer power that they hold and the impact that they can have over the population.
The traditional argument is they didn't trust government, and that's all they cared about, so they would have stuck to government. But there is an argument along the lines you're raising that they didn't trust power, not merely governmental power. And if we're talking about power so great that it almost could be governmental, as from a giant corporation, that maybe they would have been a little concerned. We have no way of knowing, but there are corporations so powerful now that in some ways they approach the power of government. Timothy Garton Ash has called Facebook and X the essentially non-nation superpowers, that they are global superpowers that just happen not to be nations. And the framers would be impressed with that. That's really quite something.
Yeah. Do you think that it's too risky now to sort of open up the can of worms when it comes to revising the First Amendment? And because there's been so many cultural shifts and technological shifts since the framers first wrote the Constitution, some might make an argument that it's necessary to make some adjustments now with social media and corporations, and then there's other people that might be like, no, we can't touch it. This is set in stone. It doesn't matter that they couldn't predict the future. They wrote it in a way that would, last for hundreds and thousands of years after they passed away. Do you think that there's an argument to be made for revising it, or do you think it's better left untouched?
Well, one argument against revising it is that all sorts of mischief might happen once you open that Pandora's box, that there are people who would say, now's our chance to, some people would say now's our chance to regulate campaign spending, to say that money is not speech, and that we should be able to restrict campaign spending, which would be shrinking the First Amendment from what it is now. Other people might say flag burning should not be speech, and so we should exclude that from First Amendment protection, which would also be shrinking it. But I guess the larger point is you don't know in what direction that would go. So there'd be some risk to it. But I'm sure it's possible to imagine the Supreme Court doing something so wacky that fans of the First Amendment would say, you know what, now's the time. We need to do something to undo this ridiculous Supreme Court decision.
I feel like, backtracking really quick, wasn't Citizens United, wasn't that the one that allowed unlimited campaign spending and said that money is not a form of speech?
It was one of several. There were several earlier ones, but it applied it to particular entities and it applied it. One of the arguments in its favor was that it was hard to say these organizations cannot spend as much as they want to, and yet the New York Times can spend as much as it wants to on politics. So there was going to be a little challenge there. But definitely Citizens United is a case that a lot of people would like to reverse.
Yeah. Kind of circling back to our hypothetical, should we revise the First Amendment? I think that there's such growing distrust in the government, especially now with the recent turn of events, that there would probably be a pretty significant uproar if they were to try and touch it at any point now. This is actually the first time in, I would say, since I've been alive, right? And since there's been since I've been on social media and just been paying attention to the news and things like that, there's been so many different things that have caused an uproar. But traditionally, I've seen this huge battle between right and left, right? People pointing fingers at each other. Still happening now, obviously. It's still very prominent. It's very divided. The nation's very divided. I think Trump's rhetoric is even more divisive. So it gets worse and worse and worse. But I will say, and I don't know if it's just like my algorithm and because it's the type of stuff that I'm interested in and the type of rhetoric and dialogue that I'm interested in. But I think that I've seen now more than ever people at least more willing to look at it as a bigger picture issue and a power issue versus a right and left issue. And I would say actually that the Charlie Kirk thing has been kind of like a catalyst for that conversation. I think I mentioned this to you briefly before, but I'm normally not a Candace Owens person. Like, that's just not I think she's very intelligent, like totally articulate. She's super impressive. There's been a lot of things that she's said that I just personally don't agree with. And I do think because she's a journalist and a media personality that she's been guilty of engaging in some of that, divisive rhetoric or saying things that are a little bit more extreme to, build an audience and garner views and things like that. As of late, she's been on my feed a lot. And, because her and Charlie Kirk were very close, I've seen her dive super deep into his killing, right? And she's, a journalist at heart, so I can definitely respect, like, the way that she's gone in and analyzed everything. It reminds me very much of myself. And she's obviously known for being, pretty conservative, a Republican, kind of a face of, like, media personalities for that end of the spectrum. And she's been, like, speaking out and saying things and kind of, touching on topics that are historically a no-no for that side of the spectrum, right? So it's been really impressive to me that she's been willing to put aside. I even saw a video where she made a comment about, I fell for the left versus right facade that I was being sold, and I'm guilty of that. But now, like, my friend was killed, and everything is different now. And she's diving deep into, like, conspiracy theory territory. Have you been following anything that, like, any of the comments that she's made or anything?
No, what's her take?
I mean, obviously it's controversial. She is basically saying that they took out Charlie Kirk because he was changing his stance on the Israel issue. He was starting to come around. She is very, she obviously, because she was close with him, she's saying things about how basically like a month before he was killed, he was in a meeting where I can't remember who it was. His name's Sam something. But he basically, the meeting was offering to re-educate him. So they invited him out to Jerusalem. They offered him a large sum of money, and he declined it. And they were basically saying, like, this is your last chance, to kind of change your mind on it. And she's on camera and she's saying, like, normally I'm not a person to release text messages. And, I just think that it's private and you just don't do that. But because my best friend just got killed, like, if anyone tries to deny this or lie or come after me, like, I will release everything. And you all know what I know. So, and, like, you just can tell that, like, she knows some things, and she's basically saying that she thinks that the things that they're saying about his killing are not adding up, the weapon used, the time frame, and she's a journalist, so she's going in depth with, like, the footage and the eyewitness accounts and things like that. She's very outspoken about not being a fan of Israel and Bibi Netanyahu and everything going on over there. And that's like a no-no for that side of the political spectrum, right? So she was explaining how Charlie Kirk was kind of coming around and starting to shift his perspective on that. And she thinks that Israel had something to do with his death. And I don't know if you saw, but Netanyahu actually posted a response, like a video, of him saying, oh, this is ridiculous. Like, Israel had nothing to do with Charlie Kirk's death. He sent me a letter, a month ago, a month before he passed away, saying how much he loved Israel. And there's just a lot of speculation, that a lot of it ties back to Israel. So that's her take on the issue. Definitely something worth looking into, especially because it's like a speech thing. But so kind of looking at his assassination overall, do you view it as an attack because of his political rhetoric, his beliefs, his philosophies? And do you see this as something that's like a threat to free speech and a form of political violence?
Well, to the broader point about her, one thing that I think it was Justice Frankfurter said in a First Amendment case, maybe in the 1950s, was the people who bring First Amendment cases are often, I think these are his words, not very nice people. They are often kind of offensive and off-putting and maybe raising conspiracy theories that other people find offensive. The Barnett case, in which the Supreme Court recognized a right to refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance, that seems like, oh, who could ever be against that? But the Jehovah's Witnesses back then were pretty in your face about it. And so there was some aggressiveness to that. Westboro Baptist Church, who've had a First Amendment win, have been pretty aggressive about that. So it often is people who are not merely wrong, maybe factually, with, for example, a conspiracy theory, but who are offending people and really troubling people who are bringing things to the courts and winning, because the First Amendment protects them the same as everybody else. The people who are totally inoffensive are not in the courts because no one's trying to censor them. It's only people who are offensive who are trying to get silenced by other people. So I think that's a kind of important distinction and something worth keeping in mind. As far as Charlie Kirk, I think, as for the guy who shot him, in a way, it's a kind of interesting biographical story of why exactly did this person do it. But as in the case of most assassins, he was probably unhinged, and there was some political element, but a lot of people share that political view and didn't assassinate anyone. So it seemed to me when it happened, the two much bigger issues were, first of all, is this a harbinger of the future where people on maybe both sides are going to start shooting people for exercising free speech? And second, will the Trump administration use this as a predicate for trying to silence debate, for trying to silence anti-Trump voices? And so far, there have been no more shootings, but there have been some indications of trying to use it to suppress debate. So I think that concern looks valid.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask you as well, is if you think that this happening will inspire or deter further acts of political violence within people that don't agree with each other's speech.
I hope not. But you can imagine a world in which it would keep going. 1968 was both Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And I can imagine that people, after the second one, thought, it's the beginning of the end. But I think it more or less stopped after that. There were a lot of riots in the cities, but the assassinations didn't keep going. So I don't know. It does seem like you could imagine a lot more violence in terms of rioting or uprisings against the police or ICE. Maybe we're seeing that now. but not necessarily assassinating speakers, especially, I guess he wasn't a gadfly, but he was kind of a provocateur as opposed to an elected official or a candidate for public office. And they have not traditionally been in danger of assassination, as far as I know.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think that this incident in particular has sparked such an interest in the issue of free speech?
Well, I think his admirers, especially in the Trump administration, made a huge deal of it, as is their right. I mean, I think it's a tragedy, of course, but they have politically exploited it for every droplet they can.
Yeah.
So I think they've made a much bigger deal of it. In terms of free speech, I mean, he was exercising his free speech and got silenced in the most profound way for it. But as far as free speech on the other side, some people have said it's like the aftermath of 9/11 when people who were saying mildly critical things about the United States were getting shut down. Or President George W. Bush said that the terrorists are cowards. And Bill Maher said on television, whatever you want to say about them, they're not cowards. It takes some bravery to fly an airplane into a building. And he was kicked off TV for saying that, that fairly moderate thing. And people have said what we're seeing now is the equivalent of that. But there's one dead guy here. It wasn't 2 towers brought down and thousands of people killed. So it seems like a much larger reaction to a much smaller event.
Yeah. College campuses in general, right, like we talked about, are kind of known for being a little bit more liberal in terms of political ideology, especially like, UNLV is one of the most diverse campuses in the nation. I personally haven't had too much experience where I felt like uncomfortable not being a full-on Democrat. There have been like certain instances, but what has like the response been to the Charlie Kirk assassination from your students? Have you guys talked about it? Has it been mixed? Have you noticed any patterns?
I haven't talked about it in classes where it was irrelevant or of marginal relevance. I'm teaching a class on political communication where the students were very eager to talk about it. And mostly, no one said negative things about him, but no one was especially defending the Trump administration. I think what I've tried to do in that class and other classes I've taught is try to make it a place where people can disagree in a decent and civil way. The First Amendment protects the worst sort of insults and the most uncivil language. And I can understand how people feel even a moral obligation to be totally insulting and uncivil when someone says, for example, you should not be in this country. You and your entire family should go back to Mexico or something. I can understand why people feel, why should I be polite to that person? But I've tried to make people in the classroom be polite and civil, and so far it's worked. So far people have been decent. In the political class, when I've taught it, I've passed out a questionnaire at the beginning and asked people their political views. Democrats always outnumber Republicans, and anti-Trump voices outnumber Trump voices vastly. And I've tried to make it a safe space, not in the sense that no one will speak against your views, but in the sense that you feel like you can express your views without getting attacked. So, because otherwise, for example, the lone Republican would never feel able to speak up if people were always saying terrible things about Republicans. So far, that seems to have worked. Maybe, as a lot of people have suggested, things are getting so polarized that it will be hopeless at some point. But so far, so good.
How do you think free speech debates differ on the left versus the right? Are both sides equally guilty of trying to limit each other's speech when it doesn't align with their views, or do you feel like one side's a little bit more extreme than the other?
I think the Republicans had a fairly principled argument that the left was worse until the last month, until the FCC business with Jimmy Kimmel and Pam Bondi talking about hate speech and all that. And at this point, they have no argument from principle at all. They are absolutely as bad as the Democrats. And I guess I would say worse because they are in power. They're actually using government power at this point, whereas the Democrats were often just using rhetorical power.
Right. I kind of want to venture into that, with the Jimmy Kimmel issue, and that's like a whole other beast to conquer. What are the free speech implications of that decision? It's since been reversed. He was back on air, I think, last night. But do you believe that was a genuine threat to speech or more of a business decision on the side of ABC?
I think with the FCC chair weighing in, there's no question but that it was a First Amendment violation, I would say, but certainly decision for ABC to decide that they were going to take him off the air and then sort of back down. I've been sort of trying to think about this. In a way, you are trying to protect yourself from power when you're speaking, say, expressing a dissenting view. And traditionally, the government has been that power. And you would protect yourself against the government by holding up the Constitution. And that was your shield. But increasingly, as you mentioned, the power is corporate power. And the Constitution doesn't work as a shield against corporations. But what does work as a shield is money. When a corporation is trying, for example, if you're an employee and a mob forms trying to cancel you and threatens your employer, says, we're going to boycott this company unless you fire someone. If you are independently wealthy, you can say, you know what, that's okay. I don't need a job anymore. So you can hold up money in place of the Constitution and you're safe. If you don't like what Twitter is doing and you're the richest guy in the world, you can buy Twitter and make it do whatever you want. Money is more important, I think, in terms of free speech than it ever was before. And we have to ask ourselves if that's the kind of system that we want to live in. It isn't government power, and so it's not a First Amendment issue. But in terms of a speaker, that may not matter. You're being silenced one way or the other. And in terms of a listener, that may not matter because you can't hear the voice you want to hear, whether it's a corporation or the government silencing them. So I think that there's a change happening there with the growth of government power that hasn't fully been appreciated so far.
Yeah. I tend to be very moderate, I would say, politically. I just enjoy playing devil's advocate too much to kind of fall on either side. So I've had this conversation with people on both sides. And, there's one of my friends in particular, he's more conservative. So, he's jumping to defending ABC's decision, right? Talking about, it's not the government. It's a private institution. It's a business decision. His ratings were already going down. This was just like the nail in the coffin, right? So people are saying it's allowed because it's a private business making a decision, the whole freedom of speech but not freedom of consequences argument. Do you think that there should be any, exceptions to the rule when, applying this principle to businesses if it's a media enterprise as large as ABC, which is quite literally, a gatekeeper of information. It's not just any business, it's not like saying something controversial and you work for Home Depot and so they're like, all right, you can't, you're encouraging violence, you can't come to work anymore. This is a gatekeeper of information that millions and millions of people watch for news and for other information. So do you think that this is a little bit different when it comes to that argument?
Well, television, as you know, is regulated by the FCC in a way that print media are not. In addition, Disney, for example, and companies owning other TV networks are just so immense that they own so many different kinds of companies. Their interests are interlocked with those of the government in so many different ways, including antitrust, that they want to placate the government as much as they can. Standing up for Jimmy Kimmel's free speech is not really a priority for them if they're afraid that their merger may get vetoed or something like that. So in those two ways, television differs from other media. And we can't really look to them for independence and courage in the way we do elsewhere. Now, we can't really look to the Washington Post, it turns out, for independence and courage either, because although it's not regulated by the FCC, Jeff Bezos has a lot of other interests, including Amazon Cloud Services, which the government has huge contracts with. So he wants to be on the right side of the Trump administration. And he would much rather compromise the independence of the Washington Post to stay on the right side of the Trump administration for what is an insignificant asset in his overall portfolio. So just sort of the growth of conglomerates and the ownership of diverse entities is creating complexities that we didn't used to have.
Right. And also, like you mentioned before, because I feel like the general public may not be totally aware of this. Obviously, we're in the journalism department, so we're aware of it. But the FCC is a government entity, right? So as soon as the chairman of the FCC steps in, which he was appointed by Trump, right?
Right. And to start with, the chairman is not supposed to weigh in by himself. There's a process. And second of all, it's supposed to take place when a TV station is up for renewal. So for the chair to speak out all by himself when there's no renewal proceeding underway is unprecedented and bad news on several levels.
Yeah, so that is the government getting involved, right?
Exactly.
So then it stops being a private issue. But kind of going back to what I was saying about, I feel like so many people don't even know what a media conglomerate is.
But to go back to your earlier point, if we take out the FCC, then what you were saying is totally true, that ABC is free to get rid of Jimmy Kimmel just because his ratings are low and because they don't like his political views. If the government isn't threatening to do something regulatory, that's fine. There's no First Amendment issue there.
Yeah.
But this was different.
Yeah. I guess I struggle with that too. Like I know on paper they're allowed to do whatever they want, but because I know about like media conglomerates and the way everything is interconnected, right? There's basically, I don't know the exact number, but I'm pretty sure now it used to be 6 media conglomerates. Now I think it's 5. One of them merged. But those 5 media conglomerates control like 90% of the media we consume here. I don't know if it's globally or in the U.S. I'd have to look it up. But there's, people at the top of that food chain for each of those conglomerates, right? And then when you start doing more research and looking into who those people are, what candidates they've donated to or who's their buddy, because they're all in cahoots, right? Then it becomes harder for me to see it as a private business decision, which it might be on paper, but I see the underlying part, which is, this is the government backhand, like they're getting involved in a backhanded way because this is their buddy, or this is, like you were saying, this company is interested in making more money. So they're going to do what they need to not piss off the administration. Wasn't there some kind of merger that was supposed to happen, that they needed the FCC's, ABC needed the FCC's permission?
It may have been DOJ, it may have been the Antitrust Division, but yes, there's something they needed the government to sign off on. And that gave them a real incentive not to do anything that would annoy the government, annoy the Trump administration specifically. Yeah.
Right. So there's just so many layers that people are not aware of in the general public.
Right. And as you were suggesting, it goes to the danger of having media organizations that have lots and lots of other interests beyond the media. Or even lots and lots of other interests within the media, but where there are conflicts of interest that the average viewer may not know about, may not be able to envision.
Yeah. So legally, ABC was allowed to release him, but then there was a response in the market as a result of that decision. Disney saw a huge drop in their stock, and they lost again, I'd have to look it up, but it was I think over $1 billion from that decision, and then very quickly he was back on the air. So do you think that, this concept of the marketplace of ideas can still thrive despite, power being so concentrated and centered around money in higher ups and in corporations?
It may turn out to be a one-of-a-kind situation. It may turn out that people are more willing to protest Trump than they would be to protest Biden, say if the Biden administration had done something like that. I'm not sure. It's a better case from my perspective where people were protesting and the result was to put a voice back than cancel culture, which is the opposite. People are protesting and the result is to take a voice off, to silence a voice. But whether it's kind of a sign of the times, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Trump is a very controversial figure, so I do think that people are motivated in ways to act against him or even with him, because he has a cult-like following, right? So I agree with you in that respect, where it's kind of like a unique situation where I don't know if you can apply the behavior of people now to other political figures. Do you think that the First Amendment is equipped to handle the challenges of the digital age and social media and corporations and all that? Or do you think that it's going to end up spiraling out of control and it will eventually have to be revised to catch up with the times?
I think you could imagine it being totally up to date. The text is short and enigmatic, but the Supreme Court has done an okay job with filling in the gaps until lately, and who knows what's going on now. The courts had traditionally recognized a pretty strong right to anonymity, and the Supreme Court, just in the last year or two, kind of took that away in terms of pornographic websites, where different states had put in place age verification rules, where if you're an adult in those states, you have to supply identification to prove your age. Previously, courts had said that was unconstitutional because you should have an anonymous right to access information as well as to provide it. So who knows? Who knows which way the courts will go next? But there's some kind of wacky indications. Justice Thomas, so far by himself, has said that minors, school children, have no First Amendment rights whatsoever. That would be a huge change. Several justices have said that New York Times versus Sullivan, which liberalized libel law, should be reversed and undone, which would be a huge change. So we'll see. Roe v. Wade is gone, and the Supreme Court majority made a real point of saying this is limited to abortion and does not apply to gay marriage or contraception. But if you look at the reasoning, it totally applies to gay marriage and contraception. They're saying, what did liberty mean circa 1789? And if you use that test, did it mean gay marriage? Obviously not. So we'll see. The auguries are not that great.
Yeah. And I think obviously you would like to think of the Supreme Court as a neutral party, that's just there to interpret the laws and not inflict personal opinion on that. But Trump has appointed quite a few justices on this new Supreme Court, right? I
think 3. And to be fair, they are the kinds of justices whom Mitt Romney or I think John McCain would have appointed. They are respectable judges. They're not like TV judges or something. They're not like Kash Patel or something. They're not sort of jokes, but they're very conservative. A lot of people thought the Supreme Court would end up being a kind of independent bulwark and act as a braking force on the Trump administration, and that Chief Justice John Roberts in particular would try to kind of slow things down. And that hasn't happened so far. Maybe it will, but so far I think a lot of people are disappointed in the court.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, the Supreme Court leaned more liberal for like a 50-year time period, right? Because they serve life. I don't want to say life sentences. That's like a punishment.
Yeah. Life tenure.
Terms.
Yeah. And the Supreme Court in the 60s was very liberal. The Supreme Court now is very, very conservative, and the liberals on the court now are not all that liberal. So right now it's very asymmetrical.
Yeah. And stuff can obviously be undone, like precedent can be undone, as we saw with Roe v. Wade and other cases. So it's hard to even predict what it'll look like in another 50, 100 years after that.
Definitely.
Have you noticed more or less polarization in the classrooms over the years of you teaching?
Maybe I'm just lucky, but the students have been well-meaning and open-minded. Some of them have very strong views, and I don't think it's ever the classroom's obligation to change people's views. The best one can hope for is to familiarize people with other views. And I've been trying to do that in the political class. This term, one of the early assignments was to ask them to come up with something the Trump administration had done that they think even opponents of the administration could support and would support. And a lot of them said the tax on tips. A few mentioned the vaccine, the Operation Warp Speed. But several came up with things I hadn't heard of. I came up with being able to keep our shoes on at the airport. But I think that's useful, making people not to change your evaluation of President Trump, but just to try to think about elements you may not have focused on. But so far, I've been fortunate. I think I have brought up in politics only in classes where it's been relevant. And it could be that professors who've had issues have been bringing it up gratuitously. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, that's good that you teach politics and haven't run into any issues.
So far. We'll see. I had, a couple years ago, I had a libertarian come and a couple people from the Democratic Socialists come and so on. So maybe that helps too. But generally, UNLV students seem open to hearing different voices. And I should say, polite to guest speakers whom they disagree with too.
Do you feel like okay as an instructor, like venturing into that territory and encouraging open discourse? Do you ever worry about getting canceled or getting in trouble with the university?
Well, the class you took, we talked a bit about censorship and banned books. And twice in the past, I've taught classes devoted to banned books. I talked to a Princeton professor early this year, and I said I would be scared to death to teach that class at Princeton. And he told me I was wrong. He said a fair-minded professor could absolutely teach banned books and have no trouble with students reacting to that. But I would still be nervous. And I guess I've been fortunate at UNLV, probably in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned that some of the ways that you encourage critical thinking, and obviously I've experienced it firsthand from having taken one of your classes, but how do you kind of push the envelope and challenge students' ideas to think outside their box and to think critically in an environment that's becoming, it seems, increasingly sensitive and divided?
Well, law school is maybe a big part of that, where often there are very strong arguments to be made on both sides, and Supreme Court cases often have a dissenting justice. And even when they don't, there are high-paid lawyers making arguments on both sides, making plausible arguments on both sides. And those high-paid lawyers often don't agree with the arguments they're making. So some of the critical thinking, I think, comes from that. In the First Amendment class, I do try to get students to argue based on what they've read in those cases, even if they don't totally agree. So that's part of it. Arguing about the law should encourage you to sort of step back and present arguments that you don't necessarily agree with, which in turn should make you more sympathetic to those two arguments you don't share.
I will say that one of the best classes that I ever took was speech and debate in high school. I took it my sophomore and junior year. I also think when I took it matters because those are formative years. You're still developing your own opinions and ideas about things. And it wasn't even, we were arguing, debating political topics. There were different topics. I did Lincoln Douglas as well. So that's a values debate. So you basically pick a value that upholds your entire argument, whether it's utilitarianism or quality of life or whatever the case may be. And then you have to build your whole argument off of that value, and you have to do it in support of whatever the topic is, an affirmative case, and against whatever the topic is, in a negative case. And both of your cases have to be equally strong for you to succeed in a debate tournament. Because when you get to the tournament, you don't know until a few, I want to say 30 minutes before your round, which one you're going to be arguing.
Right.
Sometimes you're aff, sometimes you're neg. And you have to be familiar with both cases. And it really taught me, the value of seeing both sides of things. And it puts you in a mindset where you're forced to, because obviously as a human being, you might have a personal opinion about the topic, but it just puts me in this mindset where I'm like, well, but I see where you're coming from. Oh,
right.
But I see where you're coming from.
Right. I try with papers in all classes to get students to present a strong thesis statement and to acknowledge the counter-arguments and rebut them, because it's easy to write a paper pretending there are no counter-arguments and that anyone who disagrees with you must be an idiot. And it's important to say there are strong arguments to be made on the other side, and here they are in their strongest form. And here's why I think that although strong, they're not persuasive.
Yeah.
And that's an important skill intellectually, and it's an important aspect of a paper or an argument rhetorically, too. It shows you're fair-minded.
Right. Is there anything else you'd like to add that I didn't already cover?
No, you've been very comprehensive.
Oh, good. Thank you. If you guys would like to continue the conversation with Dr. Bates, or you have any additional thoughts or questions, I will have his contact information available on my social media channel. And I will see you all again in 2 weeks for the last episode of the season and to talk more elephants.